Chapter 9. Surprises. As Nancy hit the water, the prow of the speedboat loomed overhead. Swiftly, she put one arm around the floundering child and placed the palm of her hand over Marie's face. At the same time, Nancy plunged below. Down, down, down. The little girl squirmed, but Nancy held her firmly. Looking up through the green water, she saw the black keel of the speedboat whiz past in a froth of bubbles. Instantly, Nancy shot to the surface. Barely 30 seconds had elapsed, but it seemed like an eternity. Sunlight dazzled her eyes as the strong arms of Bess and George reached down and lifted the child to the dock. "Marie," Nancy panted. Is she all right?" "She'll be okay," said George, as the child began to cry. "Marie swallowed some of the lake, that's all." By this time, the two women had rushed over. "Mommy!" cried Marie. Mrs. Eldridge scooped up her small daughter and hugged her. "My baby," the woman murmured. As she fondled the sobbing child, she looked at Nancy. "How can I ever thank you?" "Please don't," Nancy replied softly. "I'm so glad I was here." "I want to do something for you," said the grateful woman. "I live in the white cottage at the north end of the lake." Nancy smiled. "Perhaps you can, Mrs. Eldridge. I would like to ask you something." Anything, the woman said warmly. "Come sit down." She led the girls to the beach chairs and settled down comfortably with Marie on her lap. The little girl had stopped crying and cuddled up drowsily. The girls introduced themselves, and Nancy said, "Tell me, are you from St. Louis?" The woman looked amazed. "Why, yes, I am. How did you know?" "I've heard that an Eldridge family settled in Missouri many years ago," said Nancy. "They were originally from New York." "That could have been my husband's people," the woman said, looking puzzled. "What's the matter?" she added quickly, for there was a strange half-smile on Nancy's face. "I just can't believe it," Nancy said. "This must be my lucky day." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Eldridge asked. "A short time ago," Nancy began, "under rather unusual circumstances, I came into possession of an old-fashioned gold bracelet with a coat of arms on it, which I traced. It belongs to the Eldridges." "A gold bracelet!" the woman exclaimed, her cheeks flushing. "Was there an inscription on it?" "To my darling Mary, from Joe," Nancy replied. The woman grew pale. "Where is the bracelet now?" "Safe in my home in River Heights," Nancy replied reassuringly. "It must belong to my husband's Aunt Mary," Mrs. Eldridge exclaimed. "How did you get it?" As Nancy told the story, the woman listened intently, then said, "I must call my husband at once." She explained that he was in Richmond, Virginia, searching for his aunt. "She has been missing since early spring. Our aunt is a very wealthy woman, rather eccentric at times. Several months ago, she disappeared from her home, leaving a letter. It said she was on the verge of a nervous breakdown and was going to a sanatorium for a long rest. Aunt Mary asked us not to try finding her." "I'm sure she is being held not far from here," Nancy said. "I, too, am trying to find her." "And Nancy will," George declared. She and Bess told Mrs. Eldridge of their friend's success as an amateur detective. "Miss Drew has already done me one great service," Mrs. Eldridge said with a smile. She shifted the drowsy child to her shoulder and rose. "I can never thank you enough," she said as she started to leave. Suddenly, Mrs. Eldridge stopped and looked back. "I forgot to tell you. Aunt Mary has a necklace which matches the bracelet. She wore the set almost constantly from the moment Uncle Joe gave it to her 60 years ago. I'm glad you told me, said Nancy. It may be a helpful clue. As Mrs. Eldridge walked away, Nancy said to her friends, This has been a day of surprises. George grinned. You haven't seen anything yet. She pointed out to the lake. Take a look at that. A long canoe with 3 young men was heading toward shore. A shrill whistle split the air as one of them waved. Ned! Exclaimed Nancy. And Bert and Dave, Bess added. That was our secret. The boys called us last night, said George, and when we told them we were coming here, they decided to paddle over today. Ned wanted to surprise you, Nancy. He certainly did, and it's a grand surprise, she said with a broad smile. The canoe grated ashore, and the 3 athletic-looking boys jumped out. All wore dark blue Bermuda shorts with white shirts bearing the name Camp Hiawatha. Here we are, husky blonde Bert Eddleton exclaimed with a grin. The world's greatest camp counselors. He was George's special friend. Dave Evans was a rangy boy with fair hair and green eyes. Ned Nickerson, who was tall and handsome, grinned. Now with us at the lake, you girls can have some excitement. George and Bess burst into laughter, and even Nancy had to chuckle. Nancy's way ahead of you today, said George. She usually is, Ned remarked. Tell us about it. More mystery? 2 of them, said George. And a rescue. Walking up the hill to the Cornings' house, Nancy told the boys all that had happened, passing lightly over the speedboat episode. Ned gave a low whistle. You're on 2 dangerous cases, I'm afraid, Nancy. Don't forget you can count on us, Bert said, as they entered the utility room. Through an open door straight ahead, they saw Mrs. Corning in the kitchen. She was happy to meet the boys, and at once invited the 3 couples to the yacht club dance across the lake the next night. My husband and I belong and would love to have you go as our guests. I'm sure we can get time off from our camp duties, said Ned. We'll accept. Thank you. Presently, the boys said goodbye. We have to get back to our young charges, Dave remarked. See you tomorrow. The girls dressed quickly and helped their hostess prepare a dinner of steak, potatoes, green beans, and watermelon. Afterward, they insisted upon tidying the kitchen without her assistance. It was twilight by the time they finished. Nancy excused herself and slipped out the front door. Carrying a flashlight, she headed for the spot in the woods where she and Helen had seen the blue fire. After examining the singed leaves, Nancy concentrated on the ground beneath them. There were some bits of scorched brown wrapping paper. Picking them up, she wondered if they might help to explain the fire display. Nancy then hurried to her room and put the pieces away in an envelope. Maybe Ned can analyze them, she said to herself. I'll check with him tomorrow night. Though the group watched intently, the blue fire did not appear that evening. Before going to bed, Nancy told the Cornings that she was afraid Morgan might have been kidnapped. Perhaps you ought to inform the police. Mr. Corning shook his head. Morgan asked us not to, he said. I'll give him another 36 hours. Next day, there was still no sign of the missing houseman, and Nancy asked for permission to search his room. Go right ahead, said Mrs. Corning. It was an attractive room with a large window overlooking the lake. Quickly and efficiently, Nancy searched, but could find no clue to the man's whereabouts. She observed that the servant could leave the house by going through the utility room and out the side door without anyone seeing him. Has he a key to the doors? Nancy asked Mrs. Corning. Oh, yes. He usually came and went by the side door, so he wouldn't bother us. Did he have many friends? Nancy inquired. None that we know of. He was a quiet man and liked to stay by himself. Nancy looked thoughtful. The friendship card Morgan received makes me feel that an old acquaintance is after him for some reason. There may be a clue to this person in his references. If you still have them, may I examine the letters? Mrs. Corning was not sure where the papers were. I'll look for them tomorrow. After lunch, Nancy, Bess, and George drove to the eastern outskirts of River Heights to search for the Larkspur house. They were riding along a shady country road. Nancy stopped in front of a small home where a woman was trimming the hedge. Under a nearby tree sat an old lady, shelling peas. "Excuse me," said Nancy. "We're trying to find a large house in this area that has a lot of larkspur or bluebells around it. Do you know of such a place?" "Can't say I do," the woman replied. "What'd she say?" the old lady asked loudly. "Nothing, Mother. Just some house they're looking for." "She's deaf," the woman added to Nancy. "I heard that," the woman said tartly. "And I heard house and bluebells. They're looking for the bluebell house, and I know just where it is." End of chapter 9.